I used to think memory was a straight line, one event following another like beads on a string. It isn't. It loops back on itself. And lately, when I sit alone in the quiet of my apartment, folding a soft blouse before bed, I find myself returning to a version of me who didn't yet have words for what he felt. I was 11 the first time I touched my mother's silk scarf and understood, without being able to explain it, that the fabric belonged to a part of me I hadn't met yet. I didn't wear it. I didn't even hold it for long. I just stood in the hallway light for a moment, feeling something settle and something else stir, and then I folded it back exactly as I'd found it and walked away like nothing had happened. That became a pattern for years. Touch, feel, retreat. Never indulge long enough to be caught. Never indulge long enough to understand. By the time I was a teenager, the world had already taught me which feelings were acceptable to show and which ones needed to be folded away like that scarf, neat and hidden in a drawer of myself I rarely opened in daylight. I played sports because it was expected. I dated because it was expected. I learned to laugh at jokes that made my stomach tighten because not laughing would have drawn attention, and attention was the one thing I could not afford. Inside, though, there was a quieter conversation happening, one that had nothing to do with defiance or rebellion, and everything to do with comfort. I wasn't trying to become someone else. I was trying to stop pretending I already was someone simpler than I actually felt. College gave me my first real privacy, the kind that comes from a locked door and a roommate who worked nights. I bought my first dress online, paid in cash at a pharmacy gift card kiosk so there would be no trace on a bank statement, and had it shipped to a locker instead of my dorm. When it arrived, I didn't put it on right away. I sat with the box on my lap for almost an hour, and the feeling wasn't excitement exactly. It was closer to relief, the kind you feel when you've been holding your breath without realizing it and finally let it go. That night, alone, I tried it on in front of a mirror I'd angled so it couldn't be seen from the hallway. I remember the quiet more than anything. No music, no phone, just the small sound of fabric settling against skin and my own breathing slowing down. I didn't see a costume. I didn't see a joke or a secret shame waiting to be discovered. I saw, for the first time in a long while, something that felt less like performance and more like accuracy. Like a photograph finally in focus. I want to be honest about what came next because the next part of the story is not glamorous. It was loneliness. Real, aching loneliness, the kind that doesn't announce itself but sits in the corner of every room you enter. I couldn't tell my friends. I couldn't tell my family. I certainly couldn't tell the girl I was dating at the time, a kind, perceptive young woman named Mara who would later become important to this story in ways I couldn't have predicted back then. So I learned to live a kind of double accounting, one set of books for the world and one for myself, and the gap between them grew heavier every year. There were nights I sat on the floor of my apartment with everything I owned that felt like mine, really mine, spread out around me, and I cried without entirely knowing why. Not from shame, though shame was certainly present, uninvited, like a guest who lets himself in. I cried because I was tired. Tired of choosing, every single day, between being seen and being safe. Tired of needing permission from a world that hadn't been asked and would have said no if it had been. It would be years before I understood that what I was building, slowly and without a name for it, was not a secret. It was a practice. A way of caring for the parts of myself that the daylight world had no patience for. I didn't know yet that I would come to call it, privately and a little sheepishly, the gentle transformation. I only knew that some nights, putting on a soft cardigan and sitting with a cup of tea while wearing earrings no one else would ever see, felt like the only honest hour in an otherwise performed day. That hour didn't fix anything, but it kept something in me alive that needed keeping. The phrase came to me almost by accident, the way most true things do. I was in my late 20s, sitting in a small apartment that smelled faintly of the lavender lotion I'd started using as part of a private nighttime routine, and I wrote in a journal I kept hidden inside a hollowed-out book on my shelf. This doesn't have to be dramatic. It can be gentle. I read the sentence back and felt something unclench in my chest. Gentle, not a revolution. Not a confession shouted into a room that wasn't ready to hear it. Just gentleness, offered quietly to myself, on my own terms, at my own pace. That became the shape of everything that followed. I stopped thinking of crossdressing, if that's even the right word for what had become a much larger practice of self-tending, as something that needed to happen all at once or not at all. Instead, I let it become a series of small, deliberate rituals. A particular lotion applied slowly in the evening, fingers working it into skin with attention instead of haste. A drawer, locked but mine, where soft fabrics waited for nights when the apartment was empty and the curtains were drawn. A specific playlist, low and unhurried, that signaled to some old, watchful part of my brain that it was safe now, that the performance for the day was over. I want to describe the texture of those years honestly, because pressure doesn't always look like a single dramatic event. More often it looks like an accumulation of small calculations. Could I let my hair grow slightly longer without comment from coworkers? Could I buy a particular shade of nail polish and wear it only on days I worked from home, removing it carefully before any video call? Every choice was weighed against a constant, low hum of risk assessment that most people never have to perform and therefore never notice they're missing. I noticed. I noticed every single time. Mara and I were still together during part of this period, and I remember the specific quality of fear I felt whenever she came home earlier than expected. Not fear of her, exactly. Fear of the conversation I wasn't ready to have. Fear of watching her face rearrange itself around. New information about the person she thought she knew completely. I hid things not because I believed she was cruel, but because I had absorbed from years of cultural static the belief that this part of me was something to be managed rather than shared. I carried that belief like a stone in my pocket, never quite comfortable, never quite willing to set it down. What changed, slowly, wasn't the secrecy itself, but my relationship to it. I began to notice that the hours I spent in private care, the lotion, the soft fabric, the quiet music, weren't just about expression. They were regulating something. On weeks when work was especially harsh, when a manager's comment had lodged itself under my skin, those evenings of gentle ritual were the only thing that brought my nervous system back down from a kind of constant, low-grade alert. I started to understand that what I had been calling a secret was actually a form of maintenance. Emotional, even spiritual maintenance. No different in function from someone else's evening run or someone else's hour with a guitar. I began journaling more seriously, not to plan some future revelation, but simply to track my own weather. I noticed patterns. The days I allowed myself even 10 minutes of unhurried, private self-care were days I was calmer with strangers, more patient with myself, less likely to snap at small frustrations. The days I denied myself that hour, usually out of guilt or fear or simple exhaustion, were the days loneliness sat heaviest in my chest, an ache with no clear cause that I now recognize, looking back, as the cost of constant self-suppression. Slowly, almost without my noticing the exact moment it happened, the gentle transformation stopped being a phrase in a hidden journal and became something closer to a philosophy. Not an event to wait for, not a door to walk through dramatically, but a way of moving through ordinary days with slightly more honesty than the day before. I didn't need anyone's permission for that. I only needed time and the willingness to be patient with myself the way I would have wanted someone else to be patient with me. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being loved by someone who only knows part of you, and I lived inside that loneliness for longer than I'm proud of. Mara was patient, observant, the kind of partner who notices when something shifts in a room even if she can't name what it is. I think she sensed, long before I told her anything, that I was holding something back. Not infidelity, not anything dramatic. Just a closed door in a house she otherwise had full access to. The night I finally told her, I had rehearsed the words so many times in the shower, in the car, in the quiet hour after she fell asleep, that when the moment actually came it felt strangely unscripted. I told her about the silk scarf when I was 11. I told her about the locker where my first dress had been shipped. I told her about the lavender lotion and the locked drawer and the low, unhurried music that had become, over years, a kind of private liturgy. I told her I didn't have a clean word for what this was, only that it had kept me steady through years she hadn't fully understood, and that I was tired of being steady alone. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. I remember bracing for several different versions of her response and receiving none of them. Instead, she asked a simple question. She asked what it felt like in the actual moment, not as an identity or a label, but as a physical, present-tense experience. I told her it felt like exhaling, like finally setting down a posture I'd been holding so long I'd forgotten it was a posture at all. What surprised me most, in the weeks that followed, wasn't her acceptance, though that mattered enormously. It was her curiosity. She began to ask, gently, about the routines I'd built. Not to participate in them necessarily, but to understand the architecture of something that had clearly been holding me together for years. There's a particular dignity in being asked sincere questions about a part of yourself you'd assumed could only ever be tolerated, never actually understood, and I felt that dignity settle into me slowly, like warmth returning to a numb limb. I won't pretend the transition into greater openness was without its own friction. There were nights Mara needed space to process her own feelings, her own surprise, her own quiet reckoning with assumptions she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. I had to learn patience in a new direction, extending to her the same gentleness I had slowly learned to extend to myself. It wasn't a single triumphant scene. It was, like everything else in this story, a gradual recalibration, one conversation and one ordinary evening at a time. What I remember most clearly from that period is a particular evening, maybe 4 months after I'd told her everything, when she came into the room while I was applying lotion with the same slow attention I always had, and instead of leaving to give me privacy, she simply sat on the edge of the bed and talked to me about her day. Nothing about the routine itself was remarkable. What was remarkable was that, for the first time in my adult life, this private ritual was no longer happening in a sealed-off room of my existence. It was simply part of an ordinary evening, witnessed without being scrutinized, accepted without needing to be explained again and again. That shift, more than any single dramatic moment, is what I think of when I try to locate the heart of this story. Not a coming out, not a transformation scene, but the slow dissolving of the wall between the self I performed and the self I tended in private. The gentle transformation had never been about becoming someone new. It had always been about closing the distance between who I appeared to be and who I actually was, one unhurried evening at a time. People sometimes assume that once you are seen, the work is finished. I assumed this too for a while. I thought that telling Mara, that letting one person fully into the room I'd kept locked for decades, would resolve something permanently, the way a key finally turning resolves the tension of a stuck door. It didn't work quite that simply. What I found instead was that openness didn't erase the years of internalized caution. It simply gave me a new context in which to slowly, deliberately unlearn it. I returned to my old rituals with new eyes. The lavender lotion, the soft fabrics, the unhurried music, none of these needed to change in their essential form. What changed was my relationship to them. Where once they had been acts of stolen privacy, performed quickly and anxiously like contraband, they slowly became acts of unhurried care, performed with the same calm attention someone might bring to tending a garden they were finally allowed to plant in open soil. I started paying closer attention to texture and detail, not out of vanity, but out of a kind of patient curiosity I hadn't previously had room for. I noticed which fabrics made my shoulders relax and which ones, despite looking lovely, left me oddly tense. I noticed that certain colors made me feel grounded while others, for reasons I couldn't always articulate, left me feeling slightly performative, as if I were dressing for an audience rather than for myself. Over time, this attentiveness became its own quiet skill, the ability to distinguish between expression that served me and expression that merely imitated an idea of what expression should look like. Mara, for her part, became less an observer and more an occasional quiet companion in these evenings, though she never tried to make them about her own participation. Sometimes she would simply read in the same room while I went through my routine, and the ordinary domesticity of that shared quiet did more to heal old wounds than any single conversation could have. There is something profoundly stabilizing about being unremarkable in front of someone about doing a private thing, and having it received as simply another Tuesday evening rather than as an event requiring commentary. This period also taught me something about the relationship between routine and identity that I hadn't expected. I had always assumed that authenticity would feel like a single, clarifying revelation, a moment where confusion resolved into certainty. Instead, I found that authenticity, at least for me, felt more like the steady accumulation of small, honest choices repeated often enough that they stopped requiring deliberation. The evening lotion. The soft fabric chosen because it felt right rather than because it needed to be hidden quickly. The unhurried 15 minutes that no longer needed to be stolen from a day that belonged to someone else's expectations. I also began, slowly, to extend the same gentleness outward that I had spent years cultivating inward. I noticed colleagues who seemed to be carrying their own quiet weights, their own locked drawers, and I found myself treating their unexplained moods with more patience than I once would have. Loneliness, I came to understand, rarely announces its source. It simply sits in a room, heavy and unspoken, and the kindest thing you can offer someone carrying it is not curiosity about its cause but simple, steady patience while they find their own way toward whatever gentleness they need. By the time several more years had passed, the gentle transformation had stopped feeling like a private philosophy I needed to defend, even to myself. It had become simply how I moved through the world, an integration rather than a performance, a Tuesday evening rather than an event. I no longer flinched at the sound of a key in the door. I no longer calculated, every single day, what could be seen and what needed to be hidden. The calculations hadn't disappeared entirely. The world outside my apartment still required its own forms of careful navigation, but inside the walls I now shared openly with Mara, something had finally, quietly, settled. I'm older now, and the urgency that defined my 20s and 30s has mellowed into something steadier, less dramatic, but more durable. The gentle transformation, the phrase I wrote in a hidden journal so many years ago, no longer describes a process I'm in the middle of. It describes, more accurately now, a way of being I've simply grown into, the way a tree grows into the particular shape its years and weather have given it. Mara and I still share quiet evenings, though our life together has changed in countless small ways over the years, the way every long relationship does. What hasn't changed is the simple, unremarkable comfort of an evening routine performed without urgency or fear. The lotion is still lavender, though I've since discovered other scents I love just as much. The fabrics are softer now, chosen with the kind of unhurried care that comes only from decades of paying attention to what genuinely soothes rather than what merely performs soothing for an imagined audience. When I look back at the 11-year-old standing in a hallway with his mother's scarf, I don't feel the embarrassment I once expected to feel. I feel something closer to tenderness. That child didn't have words yet, didn't have permission yet, didn't have anyone to model gentleness toward himself. He only had instinct, and the instinct, it turns out, was wiser than the fear that surrounded it for so many years afterward. I think of him now the way I might think of a younger sibling, someone whose careful, frightened steps eventually led somewhere worth arriving at. I no longer feel the need to defend this part of my life to anyone, least of all to myself. Not because the world has become uniformly kind. It hasn't, and I remain quietly careful in certain contexts even now. But because the internal argument, the one that used to keep me up at night cataloging risks and justifications, has simply gone quiet. Some nights I still sit with a cup of tea, soft fabric against my skin, low unhurried music in the background, and the feeling is no longer relief from suppression. It is simply rest. Ordinary, unremarkable rest. The kind every person deserves at the end of an ordinary day. If there is a lesson in all of this, and I'm wary of lessons that arrive too neatly, it might be this. Transformation doesn't always announce itself with a single decisive moment. Sometimes it accumulates so slowly, through years of small private rituals, that you don't notice it happening until you look back and realize the frightened, careful person you used to be has quietly become someone calmer, someone more at peace with the gap between what the world expected and what was actually always true. I still keep a drawer of soft things, though it isn't locked anymore. I still apply lotion slowly in the evenings, still choose music that asks nothing of me but presence. The only difference that ultimately mattered, is that none of it is hidden from the people who love me, and very little of it is hidden anymore for myself. The gentle transformation was never about becoming someone new. It was about finally allowing the person I had always been enough patience, enough privacy, and enough care to simply exist without apology. That More than any single revelation is what peace has come to mean for me, an ordinary, unhurried evening, fully and quietly my own.